Like moths to a flame, you've thrown caution to the wind for a glimpse into our world. Well, now you're in it.
Welcome to Effed Up Stories.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to a new episode of Effed Up Stories. I am your host, Will Pender.
And I am your co-host, Ryan Sharp.
And tonight, I know we said not too long ago that we will be covering giants in an episode, and we will. We've actually put some time into it already. We're just not at the point that we want to, we're not happy with what we got yet. We want to make sure we get all of our ducks in a row. So tonight, because we didn't want to leave it too long before we got an episode out. This has already been delayed enough. So we're going to actually cover some of the submitted stories that we've gotten over the past month or so. And some of these stories were really, really cool. I wanted to cover them anyway. So the first one I'm going to, dissect is the giant shadowman, which was actually sent in by someone named Ryan as well. It's not our podcast, Ryan, but another Ryan. Anyway, we've all seen shadowmen. Well, I shouldn't say we have all seen, but it's common enough that many of you who are listening, and myself and Ryan in the podcast, have experienced the phenomenon that we know as shadowmen.
And if not, you have probably at least heard of it.
Yes, but what I have never heard of before, and possibly you, is the concept of giant shadowmen, which is kind of ironic because we were, going to do an episode on giants. So in some way, we kind of still get to dance on that topic a little. So anyway, without further ado, this comes from, we're just going to call him R from this point on, not to confuse that Ryan with our podcast Ryan. We're just going to call him R. So R sent this in. So this story comes from R. When he was 16, his older brother had just left for the army. He turned 18 and he took off. And he took his older brother's room, and of course he had a younger brother that he had previously been sharing a room with, that he finally got to be rid of, which I'm sure as any teenage boy growing up would really relish the the concept of getting away from that. So like a lot of people, when he was going to bed, he would pop in some earphones and he'd listen to some music as he was, falling asleep. And on this particular night, it was really stormy outside. He said it was, it was raining very heavily. It was windy and stuff like that, and he enjoyed it. And I'll join him there in saying that I also enjoy watching storms, and I find it easier to sleep too. I mean, he says the same thing. Maybe some of you do. I kind of associate it with, when school's canceled that day. You're kind of in the winter, at least anyway. You're waiting for that. Your parents to come down and say school's been canceled. But anyway, so he's sitting back there, listening to some tunes, trying to go to sleep. And as he was listening to his music, keep in mind that he had his door open, and his little brother sometimes would, he'd have a nightmare or whatever, and he'd come down the hallway to his older brother. So he left his door open so his little brother could come down and get that comfort, I guess. And so anyway, he's lying there in bed, and he notices, these shadows were coming down from the direction of his little brother's room up the hallway. And I guess he assumed that's what it was his little brother, walking down the hallway towards his room to tell him he had a bad dream or he had a nightmare or whatever. And the shadows would get closer and closer and closer, and he just, he listened to his music. He stared at the doorway, and then he said he saw something that he would never forget. And what he saw, how he described it, was a black outline of a person on the left side of his door. Now, this door was about a foot from his stairs, and on the right side of his door, he actually saw another one. And he wore glasses, and I guess this really, kind of frightened him, and he grabbed his glasses so he could get a better look at what was going on. And he could see that the one on the left side of his door was about the height of his room door, which is 7 feet. And the figure that was on the right side of the door was about a foot taller, he said. So, this thing was 8 feet tall. And he said the figure actually had to bend his neck, slant his head inwards to fit it under the door entrance. And he said these two figures who were standing at the side of his door, they kind of peered, like they when the one bent inwards, the other one kind of reached his head, and they were peering around the dark room. They were, the way he put it was, it's as if they were looking and wondering if he was asleep. And R said he was so terrified and in shock, that he just lay there, like he couldn't move, he couldn't say anything. He was just frozen. And he said, despite the fact that the light was on in his room, he couldn't see any features on these figures at all. Instead, all he could see was the black outline that went around both of the figures. And he said they were solid. It was solid shadow. I guess that's how I picture shadow people as well. Of course, it's usually kind of hazy if you've ever seen them. You usually see them in your peripherals, and you just see that, you never really get a good look, right? But he had a really good look, and he said that no features, solid black outline. So as he's watching them, he is taking into the specifics about them. And one of the things that he said was that they were extremely thin. He said, they couldn't be more than 150 pounds each. And, that's taking into account that, like, one's 7 feet tall and one's, 8 feet tall. He said they had long, thin arms and legs. And, reading that, the first thing I thought was Slender Man, which I know is a creepypasta made-up story that really, really got popular. But that's what it brings to mind. But anyway, that's how he describes them. And he said what scared him the most was the idea of where these two entities even came from and how long they had actually been staring inside his room. They weren't a spectral ghost spirit or whatever. He said that, they actually cast shadows. And as he was staring at these things, he said that the one on the left, he said it must have come up the stairs, and the one on the right had to have come from his little brother's room down the hall. So he doesn't understand, they would have had to come in separate entrance ways. It's just strange all the way around. And as he was staring at the doorway, both of these things paired in the door from opposite sides. So that was weird. And he said that neither one of them made any sounds. He said it was complete and utter silence except for, I guess the chaos that was going on in his head. It's his own alarm bells. And as they both peered into his room, he said, he could see movement, yet he couldn't hear anything. And they would move in. It's like they were slowly inching in closer and closer and closer, as if they were trying to get through his door at the same time, and getting like the Three Stooges syndrome, where two people or three people try to squeeze in and they can't fit together. So anyway, he said they surveyed the room before they decide to enter, like they were making a decision, like, is it safe to go in here? What's in here? Like, they wanted to scope it out before they attempted to get in. And once they made their decision, once they were getting ready to do this, he freaked out. He screamed. He lost his shit. And so at the same time,
which I think is pretty excusable under the circumstances.
Oh yeah, but like it wasn't even just concern for himself. He was very concerned for his little brother, who was up the hallway, who he assumed that, I guess he doesn't know. Could they have gone to his little brother's room first, right? And, he said his earphones were still in his ears at this point, but, after he had his freak out or whatever, he ripped those out of his ears. He said it by his own admission that, like, he was used to, he'd been able to bench 250 pounds. He weighed 175 pounds. He was about 6 feet tall. And, it scared the shit out of him, right? So he said he screamed for what felt like about a minute. And once he did that, these entities, whatever they were, they both, of course, put their attention directly on him. And once they started to look at him, and this was weird, he said they stared at him as if they were interested in the sound that he was making, right? As if it was new to them and they were trying to understand this sound that was coming out of his mouth. And while they were interested and they were staring, he said he heard his dad get out of bed and start, like, the feet hitting the ground and the shuffling and probably my fucking kids are driving me crazy. I can't get a peaceful night's sleep. And his dad finally, as he got out of bed and made this noise, he said that these entities that were in the doorway finally moved away. He said the one that was on the the left side of the door, it went left as if to go downstairs, and the one on the right hand side went back up the hallway. So again, he didn't know where they could go, but anyway, they left, and as they left, his dad threw open his door, pissed off, of course, that he woke him up, and he told his dad what he saw. He explained it. And his dad told him that you were dreaming, and as he put it, he angrily went back to bed, right? Refusing to believe what had happened. So his father's explanation, like it always is the case to kids with these kinds of things, took about 5 seconds, right? It's bullshit. Go back to bed. I got to get up in the morning. But anyway, he was still concerned for his little brother. So, he went over to his little brother's room after his dad went to bed, and on his way there, he noticed that, no window had been opened, nothing was moved. His little brother was still asleep. He didn't even wake up during this whole thing. It was seemingly fine. But on his way back, he turned on the office light, and this was the room between his room and his brother's room, just to see, because he was curious, like, where could these things have gone? How could they have left? And as he was thinking about this stuff, he went downstairs again too, and he checked the door. He checked basically the whole house, and he couldn't really come up with an explanation. The only thing he could think of was that these two entities could either turn invisible, and they just like hung around in the corners when he got up to look for them, or they would have had to, float through the walls. They would have had, if any of you guys play video games, there's like no clipping. You clip through objects. And that's the way he described it. And, really, I don't know what I could say that would explain it either.
It's quite you hear a lot of shadow people stories, but there's not too often you get one that details a giant or a pair of giant shadow men. And, I guess it would really depend on what camp you're from, or what which idea that you really take to heart. Like, what are the shadow men? And of course we've had discussions about the Jinn and their tendency, I guess, to spy on those of us here in our little part of the universe, our dimension, if you will. And I've heard people refer to the image that they create in our material plane, I guess is the word. When they get close, when they're at that point where they're close enough to see across, but not close enough that they're actually physically here, they appear as kind of a shadowy outline, a featureless shadow being. We're just able to visibly perceive them, but I guess for them they're viewing from a safe distance. And I guess that's kind of consistent with the way he described the whole scenario. But the Jinn generally, you would think anyways, they understand sound and understand the tendency of people to scream when they see them. So perhaps this was something else.
Yep. Well, like you mentioned, the interesting thing about the shadow people, they're often perceived to be interdimensional beings, right?
Yes.
And part of being interdimensional, and I've seen this on a TV show. I can't remember what it was, but it was a brilliant explanation that we could use for in the same scenario. And what it was, we're in a third dimension, right? So if you take a glass, a glass is kind of usually cylindrical, right? But even if you had like a statue, say you had a little statue, a statue of Jesus, right? If you wanna just have something to picture, and on the bottom of that statue, it might be circular. The base that lets it stand up, right? So in the 2D realm, if you were to lay that on a table, in 2D, the only thing that exists is that circle, because that's the base. That's the base that's touching that 2D, viewpoint, right? So if you were a 2D creature looking at that, you see a circle. But in 3 dimensions, it has all these different shapes, all these different, points of detail and stuff like that. So, in 2D, you can't perceive nearly any of what that statue consists of. And similarly, if shadow beings were, say, from the 4th dimension, if we're not saying that time is the 4th dimension, if the 4th dimension is indeed different, in the 3rd dimension, we see the shadow being. Maybe that's just a base shape, and
if they're from a place that has at least 4 spatial dimensions.
Yeah, there could be all kinds of extra detail, color, shapes, and stuff like that we just can't perceive here in the 3rd dimension. So, the only part that probably can, I guess, what's the word I'm looking for, be converted down to the 3rd dimension is that basic human shape, right? At least that's the theory anyway. So that's his story with the giant shadow man. And again, it's not just the shadow part being strange. First of all, you got 2. You almost never hear that there's more than one shadow person there, right? And then you have 2 that are giant, which is bizarre. Because I'm saying that just because of all the different stories that we hear of shadow people, we never hear that they're giant, right? I mean, he explains it as in they had to make an effort. Like one of them had to make an effort to squat down to fit underneath the arch of the door to see into his room. And the other interesting point is that they seemed like they were looking for something. I mean, in my opinion, I mean they were there very cautiously or carefully, kind
surveying the room.
Yeah, right. And then when they saw him, you know, they were very interested in the sounds he was making. So he was very alien to them, is the impression that I got. But
and I guess to just further dissect the experience, it would appear that, you know, there is definitely some form of interaction with the material world on their behalf, considering that, you know, this thing had to kind of go out of its way to look around physical objects. So we're not dealing with something that perhaps you know, can see through walls at least. That there does seem to be some interaction, some way they are here and in it, part of our reality. So they're not entirely removed, I suppose is what I'm saying.
And it also seems interesting that they seem to be able to move in and out of our dimension at will. Because in all of these stories, I mean, even in our own experiences, you know, when you see those things, you never really, I mean, in your house, I mean, a lot of people see them in their house, right? In your peripherals and that kind of thing. And you can never really see where they would have gone to hide. Like if you ran after it and turn on all the lights, you'll often find nothing. Actually, you'll always find nothing.
Yeah.
If you found something, you probably wouldn't live to tell the story. So I mean, it disappears. And in ours case, you know, he sees these things and he chases it. You know, I mean, he ends up going into the office and downstairs, the only two spots that these things could have gone. And he has no, you know, the windows aren't open. There was no noise that they would have made. There was no sign that they had passed through there. So again, they were just able to, you know, get out. How did they even get in the house to begin with?
Well,
right?
And, you know, it's interesting. You find so often in a lot of these stories that, you know, there's, and not just these kinds of stories, also when it comes to extraterrestrial contact, you'll find that, you know, there are reports of these beings being able to move through solid objects. It's not a entirely bizarre circumstance to have a lot of these beings be able just to pass right through solid objects as if they weren't even there.
Yeah, well, that's the point. And the other interesting thing that we haven't touched on is that, you know, they weren't afraid of R when he started screaming, right? I mean, that didn't. They were interested. They weren't afraid or whatever. And then when his dad started to wake up, they casually left. But it's like they were smart enough to know that, you know, more of a fuss would have been made. Something more serious would have happened if the father had come out. Not necessarily that, you know, the father could have done anything. Let's face it, I don't care if you're an adult or not. You see these giant shadow men, you're probably still going to shit your pants.
Yeah, have a pretty extreme reaction one way or the other.
Yeah, I guess the difference being that nobody's going to believe a 16-year-old kid. It might be a little different if, you know, an adult gets out there and his kid's saying it and he's saying it, and you know what I mean? Like, obviously, I would expect these creatures to not want, you know, they would want to stay secretive. They wouldn't want, you know, us, you know, publicly to know that they exist.
Well, there's, you know, I mean, there may be a whole, depending on who and what they are, you know, there may indeed be a whole criteria of interaction. There may be rules. And, you know, I know immediately there's going to be some people out there who's going to jump to demon, right? But I think there's a few key things in this particular instance that kind of, points away from that. And I think the most glaring being that these things appear to show some kind of curiosity. And that's not generally something that we hear or see at all in any of the, the I guess demonic lore, or even any of the modern day interactions that people have with evil entities or demons, depending on how you want to refer to them.
That's true. Demons usually already have like an agenda, and they're not
That, or they're just straight up destructive.
Yeah, yeah. So I mean, these things to me, it's more akin to if you or I were able to travel into another dimension. We would be curious. We would be investigative. We would be, I guess, similar to how these creatures were in our place. I mean, obviously they're not afraid. They're really big, and they probably already had some kind of concept, or maybe there's been so many shadow people that have come over and have come back and like put their knowledge together in their own little encyclopedias that they came over here very confident and unafraid, and you know what I mean, like kind of like if we went if you or I went hunting a bear, right, and we had our weapons, we had our knowledge, we're not going to be so afraid to hunt bears, even though, you know what I mean, like, yeah, you're kind of armed with that knowledge and stuff like that. So
well, there's that, and then there's also the I guess the concept of I guess the metaphor to use would be to say we're watching a bear from a duck blind, up in a tree, kind of hidden but not really. The bear can kind of smell us, might be able to hear us moving around a little bit. It can't see us too well, but is definitely aware that there's an unusual presence about, that might be something similar. We might be biologists, just, studying the bear's behavior. The bear has no idea.
Yeah. So, I mean, now, Ryan, I mean, we've had our own little shadow people experiences. I don't think that mine's worthy of any airtime.
Well, and I guess, our experiences, and the reason why you say that is the same reason I would say that. It's because it's the common everyman experience. And maybe, that does bear a mention, if only to say that it's such a common experience. And, for me, there's two main places that, throughout my life I would experience shadow men that would be in your old house.
Oh, yes.
And also on my friend's farm. Growing up, I had a friend who lived on a farm, and for whatever reason, it was, it wasn't unusual to see these shadow figures out of the corner of your eye. And I guess, not that either you or I have had any fantastic experiences connected with shadow people, but just a point to mention that maybe location is also a factor.
Yeah, especially if we're talking dimensional, right?
Exactly. It's interesting that, why don't everybody see shadow people? Why don't we see them everywhere? Is it a phenomenon that is kind of regulated to certain areas? Is a certain people? I don't think it's certain people, because I've, like I said, I've seen them, but I've only seen them in two specific places. I've seen things out of the corner of my eye here and there, but mostly just in those two main. Now, I guess I say two, just looking back on past experiences, but I have had quite a few I guess, shadow people sightings in my my current residence. But likewise, in the last few places I lived, no, nothing like that. So, I guess it bears dimension only insofar that I think location, the actual physical area you're in on this planet, may have something to do with shadow people encounters.
I think you might be right on that. One thing about my old house too that I remember that you and your wife used to freak me out about was you guys would always see these black orbs that would like shoot off into my head.
Yeah, yeah.
Or something like that. Yeah, that didn't really make me feel real comfortable.
No, and I guess for good reason. Who
Yeah.
wants to have a black orb in their head?
The funny thing about that old house though, there was so much strange experiences that kind of trudged up while I lived there. That's when we had the old highway experience. It's when I saw those weird lights in the sky that time when I was... Anyway, that story's on our website. But there was just a whole bunch of different stuff that happened while I lived up there. And, would it be fair to say that maybe some places you live in can somehow contribute to...
Kind of pull you into...
Yeah, like is it just the could it be the place? Could it be the people you're hanging around with at the time? Could it be things that you're doing? There's a lot of different variables that may have some kind of weight to it, but
I've heard the magnetic argument that there may be some places that create a specific kind of magnetic field, and that field is what allows you to see into these other realms, and that even when you leave that field, whatever the special qualities of that magnetic field are, its charge, I suppose, its charge kind of lingers and stays with you for a while. I have heard that, and in mostly, not really in this context specifically, but when talking about the fairy phenomenon.
Yeah.
And that there's an individual who believes that the region that the fairies picked was determined by certain electromagnetic properties of the planet in that specific area.
Well, I'll tell you. All that being said, I mean it's an interesting subject. But one thing that we're going to be doing, of course, when we're covering user submitted stuff, it lets us kind of submit that in its own bite-sized chunk. So we do have another story, a couple stories by R, but we're going to put those in separate podcasts just to keep it kind of cohesive and relevant to that podcast. But with that said, Shadowmen is a very interesting topic. So any of you guys out there listening, if you have your own Shadowmen story, I'd like to hear it. I'm always open for those stories, and especially the more fantastical ones, because as Ryan said, there's kind of an everyman element to these stories because so many people have experienced it. But then we have these really strange ones, like our story with the the two giant ones. And it was a little more descriptive, they were looking for them. If you guys listening have some really out there stories with Shadowmen, send them to us. You can send actually any paranormal stuff you got. You can go to our official website, effedupstories.com. That's www.effedupstories.com. Click the menu, go to submissions, fill out the form, submit it, and it will... I can almost guarantee it will go on the website, and it'll probably get into a podcast as well. With that said, we hope that you'll catch us next time, and of course you can submit your stuff on our website. Catch you guys next time.
Thank you very much for listening. Good night, everybody.